In today's video, we're looking at the tragic stories of geologists who encountered deadly animals, from a cougar ambush in the forests of British Columbia to a tiger's strike in the mangroves of the Sundarbans. But first, we revisit the horrifying last moments of a geology graduate student during her research on the icy edges of Svalbard. It was August 19, 2013, on the Arctic archipelago of Svalbard, Norway. It was late in the Arctic summer, and the sun never fully set. The camp sat in a bare valley of ice and rock, with a few tents standing against the wind. Everything looked calm, but the area was never completely safe. Hannah Depp was 29 years old, a graduate student from Germany completing her research on glacial rock formations. She had worked for years to earn her spot on the university team, and was known by her professors as meticulous. This was her first Arctic trip, one she had dreamed of since childhood. Hannah was not reckless. She followed instructions closely, though she sometimes pushed herself to prove she could handle the field, as well as her more seasoned colleagues. Her group of 7 lived together in a cluster of tents near Ny-Ålesund, one of the world's northernmost settlements. The team's leader, along with a local guide, carried rifles for protection against polar bears. They were reminded daily never to wander too far alone, to keep flares close, and to scan the horizon for movement. Still, after 10 uneventful days, most of them grew comfortable. Hannah wanted to collect a final set of samples from a ridge not far from camp, and when the evening seemed calm, she chose to step out on her own. The area was mostly flat, covered with gravel, patches of ice, and exposed rock. Meltwater streams crossed the ground, and apart from the wind, the place was quiet. The camp sat in a valley surrounded by ridges, giving a sense of open visibility, though the shadows of the terrain sometimes hid movement until it was close. It was a place where silence could be misleading. Polar bears are the largest land carnivores in the world. Adult males can weigh over 1,000 pounds and measure up to 10 feet standing. They move faster than most imagine, sprinting as quickly as a human can run. Though their diet consists mainly of seals, they are opportunistic and known to stalk people on Svalbard. Attacks are rare, but when they happen, survival is slim. The locals warn every visitor, never let your guard down, and never walk alone. Warnings had been repeated many times that week. The guide had noticed tracks 2 days earlier, though no one saw the bear itself. A helicopter pilot delivering supplies had also mentioned sightings near the coast. The team discussed it over dinner, but after so many quiet nights, the words felt like distant concerns. When Hannah left camp that evening, 2 colleagues saw her cross the ridge and assumed she would return quickly. She carried no rifle and no flare, only her sampling kit and field notebook. Minutes later, a polar bear came from behind a ridge and walked directly toward the camp, closing the distance. Witnesses said it walked with slow, deliberate steps, sniffing the air. Hannah stood about 50 yards away as the bear moved closer. She noticed it and raised her arms to appear larger, as she had been taught. For a moment, the bear paused, its head tilting as if studying her. Then it lunged. The impact knocked her onto the gravel. Her scream carried across the camp as the bear pressed her down with its weight. Witnesses said she tried to move, kicking and twisting, but the animal clamped onto her shoulder, the sound of bone breaking carrying across the valley. Her colleagues scrambled for flares and fired 2 upward, but both shots missed. The bear stayed locked on her, raking at her side as the shouting around camp grew louder. Moments later, the bear began to shake her, gravel grinding into her clothing and skin. A witness later told police he heard another snap, sharper and louder than before. Another recalled how the metallic smell of blood was strong in the cold air. The group tried to get closer, waving and yelling, but the bear hardly moved off her. It then tore at her midsection, lifted her briefly, and dropped her back onto the ground with force. By the time the guide reached the site with a rifle, Hannah was motionless. A warning shot cracked through the valley, and only then did the bear retreat, slipping back into the ridges as quietly as it had arrived. The entire attack lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, blood covered the gravel, and torn pieces of her jacket lay scattered across the ground. Her sampling kit lay overturned, the notebook pages stained dark. A helicopter was called in, and she was airlifted to Longyearbyen. Despite rapid evacuation, doctors could not revive her. She was declared dead that night, her injuries far too severe. Her body was returned to Germany within days, where her funeral was held in a small village church. Classmates and family gathered in silence, remembering her dedication and the risks she had taken for her field. Norwegian authorities launched a review of safety practices for research groups on Svalbard. They reinforced the rule that no one should leave camp alone, and that rifles and flares must always be kept within reach. For Hannah's colleagues, the memory of her final moments stayed with them long after the camp was dismantled. What remained at the site was a ridge marked by scattered rocks. The last place she had stood before the silence of the Arctic was broken. From the silence of Arctic ice, where one researcher never made it back, to the dense forests of British Columbia, where another field survey turned deadly under the sudden strike of a cougar, the danger followed in a different form. It was June 12, 2014, in the backcountry of British Columbia. The day began with clear skies and mild air, the kind of weather field crews preferred for hiking ridges and mapping rock layers. The forest was quiet around them, but it was the kind of silence that never lasted. In places like this, danger was always possible, even if the men had learned to brush off the thought. Daniel Jamestone was 42 years old, a geologist from Kamloops. He had spent most of his career in fieldwork, walking long hours across mountainsides and valleys for mining surveys. He was reliable, steady, and often chosen as lead for his calm approach. Away from work, he was a family man, married with 2 children, ages 8 and 10. To friends, he was not adventurous in the reckless sense. He planned his trips carefully and made sure his team had what they needed. This survey had taken him into deeper wilderness than usual, accessible only by helicopter. The project was to map fault lines along a remote slope, part of a mining exploration program. For Daniel, the trip was routine, but he admitted to colleagues that he liked the quiet of the backcountry. He saw it as a chance to work without interruption, away from office noise and city schedules. Cougar sightings had been reported in the area, but the team of 3 believed they were safe in numbers. The terrain was rough but open in places. Gravel slopes slid underfoot, and patches of spruce and fir trees stood close together, their branches shading the ground. Meltwater from the higher ridges cut through the soil in narrow streams, and the sound of water carried faintly in the air. The remoteness made the setting feel both calm and uneasy at once, a place where few people went, but predators had lived for centuries. Cougars, also called mountain lions, are apex predators in British Columbia. Adult males can weigh up to 150 pounds and stretch over 7 feet from nose to tail. They are ambush hunters, relying on stealth and sudden bursts of speed rather than prolonged chases. Their bite force and claws are strong enough to kill deer in seconds. Attacks on people are rare, but when they happen, they are quick, violent, and often fatal if the victim is alone. Warnings had reached the crew even before their drop-off. Conservation staff had circulated alerts of cougar activity, and locals reminded the surveyors to stay close together and keep noise levels high. In the first few days, they saw no signs. By the 3rd day, they grew more relaxed, focusing on rock samples and GPS mapping. Daniel trusted the rule of safety in numbers and allowed himself to walk a little behind when checking loose outcrops. It was a small decision that would prove costly. That afternoon, the team moved across a slope of broken rock. Daniel slipped on loose ground and fell a few steps behind. The others kept walking, expecting him to catch up. Within seconds, the forest's silence broke. A cougar leapt from an overhang above, its body almost blending with the rock and brush until it was on top of him. Witnesses later described the speed as shocking and noted that cougars are almost always silent until the moment they strike. The cougar clamped its jaws on Daniel's neck and shoulder, pulling him down hard onto the gravel. He kicked and twisted, his boots scraping across the loose rock, but the weight of the animal kept him pinned. His scream carried through the trees, and the other men turned in panic. One yelled while the other threw rocks, trying to drive the animal off. A hammer struck its side, and for a moment the cougar let go. Daniel tried to move forward on his hands and knees, but before he could get far, the cat circled and lunged again. Its claws tore across his back as it clamped down once more, pressing him flat against the ground. The men later recalled the growl of the cougar, the scrape of boots against rock, and the silence when Daniel stopped moving. Blood spread across the gravel where he lay. Startled by the shouting, the animal slipped back into the brush. The two men froze in place, holding flares they had never managed to use. When they reached Daniel, his injuries were severe. The puncture wounds in his neck and shoulder bled heavily, and he was unresponsive. They used the satellite phone to call for help, but the rescue team could not reach them before nightfall. The body was retrieved by helicopter the following morning. His sampling kit and notebook were found nearby, stained with blood but still intact, the last traces of the work he had come to do. Conservation officers tracked the cougar that same day, following signs in the brush. By the following evening, it was located and euthanized, standard protocol for attacks of this kind. Officials later explained that the animal was a healthy adult male, likely hunting deer in the area. For Daniel's family in Kamloops, the news was brief and devastating. His funeral was small and private, attended by relatives, friends, and co-workers who spoke quietly about his steady character and years of dedication. Authorities used the incident as a reminder. Field crews were told again that noise and close spacing are their best defenses in cougar country. Tools like hammers and rocks had given the men seconds, but not enough. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's colleagues replayed the events again and again, remembering how fast the attack began and how quickly it ended. The wilderness that he had loved for its silence became the place where he was silenced, leaving only the empty slope and the sound of water running through the rocks. After the near-silent strike in Canada's forests, the next tragedy came in Yellowstone, where a grizzly erupted from cover and left no chance to prepare. It was September 18, 2015, in Yellowstone National Park. The early fall air was cool, and thin clouds drifted above Hayden Valley. At first, the day looked ordinary, with the same calm and quiet visitors that they often expect in the park. Yet, Hayden Valley is also a place where encounters with wildlife can turn dangerous without warning. Karen Bruce was 34 years old, a doctoral candidate in geology from Colorado. She had been working on her dissertation about volcanic rock samples and was excited to spend time in Yellowstone, where the landscape gave her material she could not find elsewhere. Karen was disciplined in her work, careful with her notes, and patient with long days in the field. She was respected by her professors and known by classmates for keeping a level head. This trip was an important step for her. She had been granted access to work with 2 park rangers who guided her through the areas where rock sampling was permitted. For Karen, it was a chance to show she could manage serious fieldwork in a demanding environment. She was aware of the risks, but believed that with trained rangers beside her, the chances of real danger were slim. Hayden Valley was broad and open, with grasslands broken by scattered brush. Bison were spread across parts of the meadow, and shallow streams ran through the low ground. The soil was damp from rain the night before, and the air was cool and steady. Visibility across the valley was generally good, but near the slopes, patches of willow and dense shrubs created cover where large animals could stay hidden until they moved into the open. Grizzly bears are among the most powerful animals in Yellowstone. Adult males can weigh more than 700 pounds and run at speeds close to 35 miles per hour. Their bite is strong enough to crush bone, and their claws can tear through muscle with ease. While most bears avoid people, surprise encounters often lead to charges. Park officials remind all visitors to carry bear spray at the ready, since even seconds of delay can make the difference between escape and tragedy. There had been warnings in the park that week. Rangers had posted notices of recent grizzly activity in the valley, especially in areas where berries were abundant. Several hikers reported seeing tracks along trails, and one group had observed a bear crossing the meadow days earlier. Karen and the rangers read the postings, but with no bears spotted during their shift, they felt the chances of trouble were low. Their bear spray stayed in their packs instead of in their hands. By mid-morning, the group stopped near a slope where Karen wanted to take samples. She moved slightly ahead of the rangers to examine the rocks. The men stayed back, watching the valley floor. The scene was quiet until a sudden movement broke the stillness. A large grizzly emerged from the brush less than 100 feet away, its head low and body tense. Karen froze as the bear charged. Witnesses later described how quickly it covered the distance, the sound of its paws pounding the ground growing louder in seconds. She stood still, arms stiff at her sides, and before she could react, the bear slammed into her and knocked her flat onto the wet soil. The rangers shouted and rushed for their spray, but the canisters were buried in their packs. The bear clamped its jaws onto Karen's side and pressed her against the ground. She tried to twist, her boots sliding in the mud, but the animal pinned her with its full weight. One ranger pulled out his spray too late, and the other threw a rock, but neither action changed the attack. The bear pressed her harder into the ground, then raked its claws across her torso, tearing through her jacket and skin. Witnesses later said what stayed with them was the mix of sounds: the bear's heavy breathing, the scrape of soil under its paws, and the short cries that ended too soon. The struggle did not last long. As the rangers shouted and tried to move closer, the grizzly finally released her, backed away from the body, and turned into the brush until it was out of sight. The rangers reached Karen immediately. She was motionless, her injuries severe and beyond help. They radioed for emergency assistance, and within minutes, medics were on their way. A rescue team arrived quickly by vehicle, but there was nothing more to do. She was declared dead at the scene. Her body was flown back to Denver, where her funeral was small and quiet, attended by family, professors, and classmates. Her colleagues described her as determined and committed, someone who cared about her work and believed in finishing what she started. Park officials reviewed the case and stressed the same lesson they had repeated for years. Bear spray must be kept ready, not stored in packs. They reminded researchers and visitors alike that even trained rangers are at risk when basic precautions are missed. Karen's death became another example of how fast a grizzly encounter can turn fatal, and how even experienced people can underestimate the speed and strength of the animals that live in Yellowstone. The force that ended a researcher's life in Yellowstone was sudden and unstoppable, but what followed in Kenya showed an even greater weight of danger, as a bull elephant charged through dusk and left no chance of survival. It was July 7th, 2016, in Kenya's Rift Valley. The sun was setting low in the sky, and the long shadows from the escarpments stretched across the farmland. The evening was calm, with only the sound of birds calling from the trees. But in this region, where farms and wild bushland met, dusk was often the most dangerous time of day. Michael Mitzifor was 47 years old, a geologist from Nigeria. He had worked for more than 20 years in the field and was respected for his patience and attention to detail. His colleagues knew him as steady and methodical, someone who double-checked samples and recorded notes carefully, even after long, exhausting hours. Away from work, Michael was a family man. He lived in Lagos with his wife and 2 grown children. He often spoke of wanting to give his children the stability he never had in his early years. His work in geology had allowed him to travel, but the demands were difficult. This assignment in Kenya was important to him, not only for his career, but also because the pay would help support his children through university. For him, the risks of working in remote terrain were outweighed by the chance to build a stronger future for his family. The survey site was set along the Rift Valley escarpments. The ground was dry with loose soil, rocks, and small patches of farmland next to the bush. Fields of maize and millet bordered the area, and acacia trees grew in scattered groups. When the wind picked up, dust was carried through the air. At dusk, the light dropped fast, and shrubs along the edge of the bush made it hard to see movement until it was close. Elephants are common in this part of the valley. Adult bulls can weigh as much as 12,000 pounds and stand more than 10 feet at the shoulder. Despite their size, they move quickly, reaching nearly 25 miles per hour when charging. Their tusks can puncture with lethal force, and their trunks and legs are powerful enough to crush. While many elephants are calm if left alone, they become aggressive when startled or when they believe humans are too close to feeding areas or calves. In the days before the incident, the survey team had been warned. Villagers pointed out fresh dung and trampled paths near water points where elephants had passed recently. They urged the geologists not to linger after sundown. The warnings were clear, but the team was focused on completing their work. With equipment scattered across the site, Michael and the others felt it was better to pack everything before leaving. They had already stayed late the previous 2 nights and wanted to avoid coming back for gear in the morning. That evening, Michael lifted one of the heavier cases, balancing it awkwardly as the light faded. His teammates were collecting their tools, moving slowly across the uneven ground. The fields were quiet, and for a moment it seemed like they would finish without issue. Then the stillness was broken by a sharp trumpeting. From the edge of the bush, a bull elephant stepped into view. Its ears were spread wide, and its trunk swung low, dust rising around its feet. Witnesses said the animal appeared tense, moving with purpose as it advanced. Some later suggested the elephant had been disturbed by nearby farming activity, which often pushed animals closer to human paths. Whatever the cause, the bull was already agitated when it spotted the survey team. Michael tried to move quickly, but the heavy case slowed him. The elephant lowered its head and charged, its steps pounding against the dry soil and echoing across the field. In seconds, it closed the gap. Michael stumbled, the equipment slipping from his shoulder. The bull drove a tusk into his side and knocked him down hard. The others scattered, some diving behind bushes, others sprinting toward the edge of the fields. They shouted, waving their arms, but none dared move closer. The elephant pressed its weight onto Michael, trampling him into the dirt. Witnesses described the thudding sound of each step, the crack of bone, and the dust cloud that rose with every movement. Michael stopped moving after the first impact. The bull trumpeted once more, then turned back toward the bush. In a short time, it moved out of sight into the trees. The field stayed quiet except for the voices of the men as they came back together. When the team approached, Michael was lying face down in the dirt. His clothing was torn, his gear lay scattered, and the dust around him was marked with deep impressions from the elephant's feet. The team radioed for assistance. But with darkness setting in, recovery had to wait until morning. They stayed nearby through the night, keeping watch for more movement in the bush. At dusk, they covered Michael with a canvas sheet from their supplies, then waited until authorities could reach the site at first light. Authorities later arrived with vehicles to collect the body. His remains were placed in a stretcher and covered before being transported out of the valley. His samples and notebooks, some stained and damaged, were also gathered. Within days, his body was flown back to Nigeria. The funeral was held in his hometown, where family, friends, and colleagues gathered. It was a quiet service, with co-workers remembering him as disciplined and steady, someone who gave careful effort to his work. His children, now left without their father, carried forward his memory as a man who valued persistence and sacrifice. Kenyan officials later reviewed the case. They reminded companies to end fieldwork earlier in the evening and to take local warnings seriously when elephants were active nearby. Coverage of the incident remained regional and received little international notice. For Michael's team, however, the memory stayed vivid. The place where they had measured rocks and collected samples became the place where they witnessed how quickly safety could end when the path of humans and wildlife crossed. One stumble in the Rift Valley was enough for an elephant to end a life. And in the Sundarbans, even the smallest gap in a group was all it took for a tiger to claim another. It was November 12, 2018, in the Sundarbans along the Bangladesh-India border. The tide was low, and the mangroves spread out in a maze of roots and narrow channels. To most, the morning looked ordinary, with still water and the calls of distant birds. Yet in this place, danger often came quickly, hidden in the thick brush where the forest met the mud flats. What seemed quiet could change in seconds. Arif Hossein was 38, a geologist from Khulna, working on a government contract to collect soil samples from the coastal forest. He was steady in his work and had a reputation for being patient, careful with measurements, and dependable when deadlines pressed. His wife and young daughter depended on his income, and though he knew of the tiger risks in the region, he agreed to the assignment because it offered more pay than his usual work. For him, this trip was both a responsibility and a chance to prove himself reliable to his superiors. He had heard stories of tigers moving through villages, taking livestock, even people, yet he believed the team's size and the presence of rangers would reduce the risk. The team agreed to keep close, finish the soil sampling quickly, and head out well before dusk. He carried a small kit, tools for digging, and a notebook to mark sample points. A small tin of chili powder, sometimes used as a crude deterrent in the Sundarbans, had been left behind with one of the rangers. At the time, it seemed unimportant. The Sundarbans were a challenging environment to work in. Mangroves grew tightly along the creeks, their roots sticking out of the mud. The air smelled of salt water mixed with decay from plants left behind as the tide went out. Crabs moved across the mud while birds searched in the shallows. The canopy blocked much of the light, and once away from the open banks, it was hard to see more than a few yards. In that cover, movement could stay hidden until it was near. Tigers in the Sundarbans are smaller than those found inland. Adult males usually weigh between 350 and 420 pounds, still powerful animals with long limbs adapted for moving through swamps and mangroves. They are capable swimmers, often crossing tidal channels, and their diet includes deer, boar, and sometimes people. Unlike tigers in many parks, Sundarbans tigers are often bolder around humans, shaped by years of living in overlapping territory with villages and fishing grounds. Attacks are not rare, and locals recognize that the animals strike quickly and with little warning. That morning, the team worked near a creek, the tide pulling water out and exposing soft mud along the banks. Villagers had warned them earlier about recent tiger tracks near farmland only a few kilometers away. The rangers repeated their instructions to stay close, avoid the thickest cover, and remain alert. Even in daylight, the mangroves were dim, and movement could be hidden within a few yards. As the group spread slightly to check different soil points, gaps opened between them. Arif stepped several yards off the main path toward a patch of exposed ground where he wanted a cleaner sample. His colleagues could still see him, but the brush behind him was dense. The men later said they noticed how quiet it had become. Bird calls stopped, and the sound of crabs moving in the mud was suddenly sharp. One ranger had begun scanning the tree line when it happened. A tiger came out of cover with sudden speed, its body low, crossing the distance in seconds. Arif barely turned before it struck, clamping its jaws into his neck and shoulder and forcing him into the mud. The weight of the animal pinned him before he could struggle upright. Witnesses shouted, some throwing sticks and striking metal to make noise. The tiger did not let go, pulling Arif backward into thicker cover. His boots scraped against roots, leaving marks in the mud. For a brief moment, the men still saw him on the ground with the animal over him, before both slipped deeper into the mangroves and out of sight. The sounds carried longer than the sight. Colleagues later recalled hearing only a few short cries, cut off quickly, along with the snapping of branches as the tiger dragged him into cover. Within moments, the swamp was silent again. The group advanced only a short distance before stopping. The ground was unstable, and they feared provoking the animal further. Rangers fired a warning shot into the air, but by then, both Arif and the tiger were gone. Search teams returned the following morning with more rangers and villagers who knew the terrain. They followed drag marks in the mud, broken roots, and patches of blood. About 200 yards from the site, they found parts of his kit, his sample bag torn, notebook soaked, and a tool partly buried in wet soil. Deeper inside the mangroves, they discovered partial remains, scattered near roots where the tiger had fed. The recovery was slow and careful, the team using poles to probe the mud before stepping in. His body was flown back to Khulna 2 days later. The funeral was held in his neighborhood, attended by relatives, neighbors, and colleagues from his department. The service was quiet, marked by prayers and the simple acknowledgement of a life ended in the line of work. His wife and young daughter received modest support from authorities, though far less than many had hoped. Officials classified it as part of the ongoing human-tiger conflict in the Sundarbans, noting that such attacks, while tragic, were an established risk in the region. The story did not spread far beyond local papers. For those who worked with him, it was a reminder of how quickly conditions in the field could turn. For the villagers who lived near the mangroves, it was another chapter in a long history of living alongside tigers, one where the balance of survival often tipped unpredictably. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love the one waiting for you on the end screen. Go check it out, and I'll see you there.